All right, so in chapter 14, we've learned and introduced aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is a similar model to supply and demand with some extra twists. And we've learned what are the different things that shift aggregate demand, how it's constructed. So remind yourself what are on the axes. So on the vertical axis, it's the price level. On the horizontal axis, it's the level of output, the potential output, and everything else. And essentially, aggregate demand, just see it as anything that changes gross domestic product. So whether it's consumption, investment, government spending, exports or imports, any of those things will create a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Whereas when we look at the aggregate supply curve, you could go back to macroeconomics and see it quite simply as just technology and change in the prices of inputs, such as salaries, wages, and but you could also think a little bit bigger picture. You could look at population size. You could look at droughts and other things of that kind of nature. Overall, though, if you just kind of focus on that input costs, you get a lot of the picture from there already. So then we introduced this macroeconomic equilibrium between aggregate demand, which is a downward sloping demand curve, aggregate supply, which is upward sloping, such as the supply curve we've used to seeing, and long run aggregate supply, which is a vertical supply curve. Essentially, the long run aggregate supply, what it gives us is it says that no matter what the price level is at, for a certain population size, certain technology, and other factors that are treated as constant for that time that we're looking at, there's a potential output. So if you think of a classroom or you think about anywhere else where you have a certain amount of people, well, let's say I have those 100 people working for me making shirts and microphones or something else. And no matter what the price level is, if they're all working 40 hours a week for a certain given technology, they're pretty much going to produce the same amount of output. Even if I double the price of the goods that I sell, I won't really produce more. So that's seen as fixed. So things always kind of converge back to that. So it creates a macroeconomic equilibrium. We've seen instability. We've seen that if the government does not intervene, what's going to happen over time is that wages will adjust. So if we're in a recession, wages will adjust downwards, shifting the aggregate supply curve back to the long run equilibrium situation. And the government may intervene. We started looking at this idea of stimulating aggregate demand, but it's really in chapter 15 that we're going to look at what are the main ways where they can stimulate aggregate demand. But for now, just understanding how the curves are made, how they shift, and what's the kind of long run outcome that we expect is the main part that you should have understood at this point from this chapter.